So when we read Nietzsche on early Greek philosophy, one thing that I try to make clear or make apparent for us is this idea: when you are writing about the ancient philosophers, ancient Greek philosophy, you really need to take his context into consideration. So he is actually writing about what philosophy is, what philosophy should be, how he understands philosophy at that particular time. So when we say Greek philosophy, we are always talking about a construction. People constructing it, they are saying as much about their current situation of philosophy and their understanding philosophy as much as ancient Greek philosophy. So it is not just studying an object called Greek philosophy, but studying yourself in relation to what you consider to be the beginning of philosophy. So when he says, for example, on page 39, he says, the philosophy, well, it starts on page 38, section 3. Greek philosophy seems to begin with an absurd notion. Now, right there, like that absurdity is really our understanding of that. So Thales didn't say like, I'm going to start with an absurd notion now, and that's water, right? So that's not how it works. So we judge it to be absurd, and we construct this as absurd. And we also construct it a little bit like disappointing, you know, this philosophy, blah, blah. But then the first philosopher makes this what we consider to be a naive statement. Now, Nietzsche then constructs this statement as water is the primal origin of and the womb of all things. So is it necessary for us to take serious notice of this proposition? Even the way in which he formulates the question is like, are we supposed to take this seriously? What would it mean for us to take this seriously? And if we do, what would it mean for us? Because Thales is long gone. I don't think Thales is particularly concerned about being taken seriously or not. But this is a task for us. Do we take this seriously? And we take this seriously, and we don't take other things seriously. So we take Thales seriously, we take philosophical tradition seriously, we take this and that person seriously, and we have been doing this for thousands of, well, hundreds or thousands of years. So when it comes to Nietzsche, Greek philosophy is always already part of his identity, part of his study, part of his culture, part of his academic. I mean, he was a philologist, so there is a, you know, discipline called philology that studies ancient Greek language, etc. So these are already established. We have already taken him seriously. And now, by asking that question again, what is it that we take seriously? So it is, he says, and for 3 reasons. First, because it tells something about the primal origin of all things. Well, we take such things seriously. Second, because it does so in a language devoid of image or fable. Like, he doesn't talk about like somebody carrying the earth on its back and the goats and blah, blah, that kind of image and fable. Like, it doesn't appear to be metaphorical. It seems to be pretty straightforward in terms of literal, right? And finally, because containing it, if only embryonically, is the thought all things are one. Now, what's the difference between that there is a primal origin of all things and then all things are one? That's a very significant distinction, that everything like historically or in terms of generation comes from one origin, as opposed to everything is one. Right? So that's what some of you already picked up on, this idea of arche, the origin, not just where everything comes from, but also all is one. The first reason still leaves Thales in the company of religious and superstitious, which we still continue to judge what is like a fable, what is like a story, as superstition. We believe them to be wrong. we believe the Greeks who explained the world in terms of fables and superstition are wrong, right? The second takes him out of such company and shows him as a natural scientist. So the distinction between natural scientist and not a scientist, I suppose, or some superstition is the language. Like what kind of language do you use? Does your language have metaphors? And if you are in science, you don't use metaphors, you don't use fables, you just use straightforward language, right? But the third makes him the first Greek philosopher. So now he is, in his mind, established a distinction, excuse me, between science and philosophy. A distinction that probably doesn't exist for Thales. So when he reads Thales and interprets Thales, he is already operating with a set of assumptions that he brings to the table. Because we discussed this a number of times, both Charlie and Jack brought it up, that it doesn't seem to be that they have such clear distinctions. So Thales didn't say, okay, now I'm saying this as a scientist, let me stop there, and then I'm going to say now as a philosopher. He says, I mean, I don't even know what he says, but allegedly what he said was everything comes from water. So that statement doesn't even have that distinction that Nietzsche attributes to it. So yet he goes back and says, well, Thales didn't, he is a philosopher, but he did not, it is true, overcome the low level of empiric insight prevalent in his time. So now, even if somebody could reasonably demonstrate to you in your eyes, like, look, this water is the source of all life, you still kind of believe that that origin leaves a lot of things that are unexplained, right? And you already think in terms of opposition, things that are not water. And that substance is insufficient, so you either need to add to the principle or give me an explanation of how that takes place. That is the philosophical, apparently, for him. So here he makes this distinction, and I think that's on page 40. That is, what then, this is the middle of the page on 41, what then is that brings philosophical thinking so quickly to its goal? Is it different from the thinking that calculates and measures only by virtue of the greater rapidity with which it transcends all space? No. Its feats are propelled by an alien, illogical power, the power of creative imagination. Now, Nietzsche believes that philosophy is a creative imagination. He attributes that to Thales. Now, Thales may or may not be creative imagination. I think that's a sort of objective sounding question, which is not as relevant as the fact that how Nietzsche understands what philosophy is and what he understands of what philosophy is to Thales. He attributes that to Thales. And that's the beauty of reading, because whenever you make statements about something, you are immediately making statements about yourself. Well, Nietzsche is, at least in this context. So, on just one more thing and then I'll open up. On page 41, I do not mean, of course, that Thales' thought in some attenuated and restricted sense contains a sort of poetic truth. One might imagine there could be some sort of value in it for an artist, for example, who, while standing by a waterfall and seeing in the watery masses that leap toward him the playful created models of man, animals, masks, plants, rocks, nymphs, griffins, and the whole typology, in fact, of sculpture, might well find the proposition, all is water, a true one. That's why I just this passage kind of convinced me that we should go there and see, and Miletus, and then, well, unfortunately, it's not next to water anymore, but it used to be, and like see the kind of water, and it's like some poetic truth, just to even make sense of this statement of Nietzsche. So when we did our epic adventure, whatever it's called, trip to Turkey. That was really the passage that we were reading, like, in the Aegean Sea when you see the water. And yes, it has a different connotation, but he says, that's not the poetic truth that I'm talking about. On the contrary, the thought of Thales, even after the realization that it is unprovable, has its value precisely in the fact that it was meant non-mythically and non-allegorically. So this is not an allegory, that's not a metaphoric sort of, that it is meant. The Greeks among whom Thales stood out so suddenly were the very opposite of realists in that they believed only in the reality of man and God, looking upon all nature but as a disguise, a masquerade, or a metamorphosis of this God-man. Man for them was the truth and the core of all things. Everything else was but semblance and the play of illusion. Now, that's a very complicated idea, because for Thales, man is not the measure of all things. Nature is something else. So what makes it philosophical for us, even the most personal is sublimated back into an abstraction. For them, the greatest abstraction kept running back into a person. So their person is according to whom you are organizing philosophical thought. And that's the first step in understanding philosophy as a way of life. We are formulating it in terms of a person. Now, that doesn't make it subjective, that doesn't make it personal, it just makes the value of philosophy only in relation to life, how you should live. What does it mean to say something like everything is water, whether it is true or not, scientifically provable or not, etc., how that's going to shape your life. That's the issue. Now, it might not at all. I mean, obviously for us today, it doesn't mean anything. But there he sees the proto-philosophical instinct that I'm going to shape my life as if everything is water. What that means is, I don't know, that you need to ask Thales. What for us, we isolate the principle, that's how we live. All is one. Now, is all one? I mean, scientifically, that's probably not provable, but you don't really live your life. Well, actually, you kind of do now, and maybe that's the problem. You don't really live your life according to scientifically provable facts. Because if you were, then you couldn't live properly, because whatever is proved at this point is temporary. So that would absolutely bring no stability to your life. So that's the issue, that's the problem. Do we understand that, or do you have questions? I'll stop here. Does it make sense? Yes, Jack.
It's not exactly a question about what you were just talking about, but it is a question about the text. Do you want me to ask it later, or can I?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so on like the last few pages, like 59 and all that, when they start talking about like fire and water, and how, for instance, like introduction of fire as a cosmos creating force, that's the first line of page 59. And then they juxtapose it kind of with water. And it's just like, traditionally speaking, when we think of fire, when we think of like big bangs, when we think of like explosions, right, we think of it as something as destructive, as dangerous, or at the same time, without any of those things, we wouldn't even be here, right? There would be like no living, no being.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I was pretty intrigued by just the whole relationship between like, what can destroy us is at the same time what created us. So it wasn't more of a question, I guess. I guess it was more of a kind of like a highlight, something that I found really intriguing and interesting from the readings that we did for today.
Mm. Okay, so Okay, go ahead, Blessed, sorry. You are muted. You are muted.
Sorry, I kind of like had the same feeling as Jack, but like I just found it interesting because like I thought it made everything come back full circle, because I feel like if you think about it, like the only thing that can actually uh, destroy us has to be the thing that created us. So like that's just the way that like I understood it. Like there's nothing else would be able to destroy us if it hadn't created us in the first place. That's just what I was thinking about.
Okay, that contributes to the discussion of the tragic, yes. Okay. Anybody wants to add something? Well, to me, I mean, as a modern kind of reader, for us maybe in general, I really cannot make sense of fire other than metaphorically. My mind doesn't allow me to think of fire as a non-metaphoric, non-allegoric concept. Because to me, fire means something physical, something that I can observe, something usually hot, etc. Right? So when he says, in order to illustrate the introduction of fire as a cosmos creating force, I remind the reader of the way in which Anaximander had developed the theory of water as the primal, which he didn't. I think that was essentially trusting Thales and supporting his observation with new evidence. So they don't make these distinctions. And I really cannot understand how not to make these distinctions. Do you? How not to make a distinction between a metaphorical fire in which cosmos is created, because when I think physical fire, it's like, no, that's just wrong. That's just not true. So you are low. I mean, I think to a certain extent, Nietzsche is like that too, because he says, okay, this is low level empirical observation. So he sees that he also has that notion, but he wants to insist that it is not metaphorical. It is more straightforward understanding that all is one. Now, if all is one, the only way that I can make sense of it, it really doesn't matter what you call it. Call it water, call it fire, call it apeiron, which is more appropriate because that sort of speaks to a kind of impossibility of calling it any specific thing, because to me, fire, as it did to Greeks too, is for one of the four basic elements that is separate from the others. So it's not earth, it's not air, it's not water, so it's different. So this notion that all is one, later philosophers recognize this, and Heidegger, for example, after Nietzsche, really zeroes in on this idea that there is a unity of all beings. Somehow beings are somehow unified. And that is what makes philosophy, according to Nietzsche, a question of style, a question of greatness. This is on page somewhere around that when we're talking about. So Thales was called a sage. So on page 43, I love this passage. So the Greek word designating sage is etymologically related to sapio, I taste. Sapiens, he who tastes. Sisyphus, the man of keenest taste. So taste is something about life. It's not about knowledge necessarily. So having taste in life, like, are you a tasteful person? Like, you can't just scientifically demonstrate that, right? A sharp savoring and selecting, a meaningful discriminating, in other ways, make out the peculiar art of the philosopher in the eyes of the people. So this will be clear a little bit further down the paragraph. The philosopher is not a man of intellect. if by stressing intellect, one designates a person who can see the success of his personal undertakings. So that's again another sort of, for us appealing, for me appealing notion of the definition of philosophy, which sort of goes back to Jared's question about, is it still possible to live philosophy as a way of life? Aristotle rightly says that what Thales and Anaxagoras know will be considered unusual, astonishing, difficult, and divine, but never useful, for their concern was not with the good of humanity. And that's that Nietzsche is considered to be a pessimist, although the only philosopher who is sometimes funny is Nietzsche, really. I mean, all other philosophers are not funny at all. But Nietzsche is sometimes funny, and this is one of those funny parts. Philosophy is distinguished from science, and I think that's a really cool sentence. Distinguished from science by its selectivity and its discrimination of the unusual, the astonishing, the difficult, and the divine, just as it is distinguished from intellectual cleverness by its emphasis on the useless. Science rushes headlong without selectivity, without taste, at whatever is knowable, in the blind desire to know all at any cost. Philosophical thinking, on the other hand, is ever on the scent, pursues, on the scent of those things which are most worth knowing, the great and the important insights. And one of the things that we were discussing last time, that's really a very significant aspect of philosophy, in the sense that what do you consider to be the most significant questions in your life? It's not a question of like perennial questions, like what is justice, what is blah, blah, but like what as a person you consider to be, in terms of your own taste and style, what is the most significant questions? And I think Nietzsche, among other things, sort of says like there are certain things, certain questions that are just quite boring, bad taste, not interesting. I'm not interested. I mean, honestly, like what happened in 1871 in rural Turkey when they were like analyzing their crop. I don't care. That's not important. That's not relevant. That's not gonna, I mean, it's useful, maybe it will be incredibly useful, but it's just not the way in which you want to spend your life. How do you want to spend your life? Which questions do you want to pursue? What's your style? What's your taste? Now, later on, we sort of formulate this more in terms of the question of love, both in philosophy, but also like, I don't know whether you have career consultants and stuff that you go to, or what major you should pick and how you should go about life and stuff like that. But what is it that you love? What is it that sort of attracts you? And what do you consider to be the most significant questions for you? If those questions are only for the goodness of humanity or something like that, which is kind of a little bit hubris, but still, you might. But for Nietzsche, this becomes the only way to explain this is in terms of how do you consider philosophy as a way of life? Given that you're also going to die, so it doesn't. I mean, seriously, yeah. I mean, do you think that? Okay, I'm stopping here. So that idea is very appealing to like all is one, and that he thinks that puts him to the company of the philosophical, or starts philosophy or whatever. Okay.
Fred,
Yes.
I had a question about like the ending of that chapter number 4. I guess there's like a passage. Let me see where it is. I think page 44, where Nietzsche says that what verse is for the poet, dialectical thinking is for the philosopher, just left me thinking about this conclusion that he reaches, that Thales is trying to say, talk about the unity of it all, and then ends up talking about water. How can you help us translate that to a like concrete example in philosophy? Because I thought actually the opposite until I read that. So it made me kind of, yeah, I guess I'm just a little confused.
Okay, say it again. I'm not really sure about that question. So
Yeah.
what do you think was the opposite?
Yeah, so I guess I thought of, or at least what I know from philosophy is that certainly comes off as very concrete and like exact, not exact, but like the opposite of metaphorical in a sense,
Okay.
or at least 19th century, right? So that passage kind of made me think about whether that is the case, you know, or is it just for the ancients, or I don't know how to contextualize it, basically.
Okay, let's look at that section on page 44. What verse is for the poet? Dialectical thinking is for the philosopher, right? So that kind of how certain concepts and life itself turns into its opposite. And that's really the, so the Greeks both set up these opposite, and as soon as you set up these opposites, you think in terms of these opposites and sort of simplifies, but also clarifies your mind with relation to the world. This is it, and that is not it, and even, odd, all these oppositions somehow organize the world. But Nietzsche believes that their relationship is dialectic in the sense that they turn into their opposites. You cannot even think one without the other. And that's the philosophical thinking that leads to actually, okay, despite all these differences, there is a oneness to this entire chaos or chaotic multiplicity of things, right? So he continues, he grasped for it in order to get hold of his own enchantment in order to perpetuate it. And just for the dramatist words and verse are but stammering of an alien tongue needed to tell what he has been and lived, what he could utter directly only through music and gesture, just so very profound philosophical intrusion expressed through dialectic and through scientific reflection is the only means for the philosopher to communicate what he has seen. So how do you express this oneness? How do you express this experience that in all these like chaos and oppositions, etc., there is a structure, there is a unity, there is a oneness that can be expressed. Anaximander calling it apeiron. So this is an incredibly sort of powerful and also dangerous experience of the world. There is a oneness to my multiplicity of experiences. But it is a sad means, basically a metaphoric and entirely unfaithful translation into a totally different sphere and speech. So this where Nietzsche indicates this problem of knowing, seeing, understanding something and expressing it. And how we constantly fail in our attempt to explain something that we have seen, because even within language, it is extremely, I mean, not even, especially within language, it is very difficult to express without opposition. So if everything is one, you cannot think of that genuinely without introduction of language, because if everything is one, then that is not opposed to everything is not being one. And you already think of this oneness as an oppositional category. Therefore, language fails you. So he says, thus Thales had seen the unity of all, That is, but when he went to communicate it, he found himself talking about water and completely failing it, because the unity of one cannot be just water, because in your mind, you see water as opposed to something else. And if everything is one and you say what water, I say it's either water or one. You cannot have both. So I can accept it if you are using water as a metaphor, which Nietzsche says it isn't, but that's the failure of language in the sense that it is within those oppositions that we express ourselves. So there is a notion that has always been an issue in philosophy, that language cannot truly express the structure of the world. Scientific language, philosophical language, any type of language, because it already brings reality into an oppositional structure, which language is, right? I mean, if you want to understand one, you need to at least oppose it to many or two, at the very least, right? So that's his issue with the philosophical language. It's always going to fail you. Therefore, you say water, and but it is this sort of what he calls creative imagination. You have this imagination of a unity that, when you bring into the conceptual world, is problematic.
It sort of makes me think, at least, well, I know this can be the case for like certain philosophers, but like when I start writing something, a paper, and like I have like an idea in mind, and then I end up writing and end up like with something else, which I kind of came to the conclusion from what I was writing. Like I don't, yeah, like it's just something else. Like, and it's good. Like I like it and I agree with it. And I just realized that that's like sort of my limitation. I can't really put what I wanted to say. Yeah, I don't know.
No, it's absolutely a very good observation. Therefore, I always propose papers as a process of learning rather than expressing what you learned, because you haven't started writing yet, probably. It's going to be very different once you sit down and start writing. It's cool to sit here or wherever you are sitting and listen, and I say certain things, you go like, okay, I understand it, that makes perfect sense, blah, blah. And then once you actually sit down and express it yourself, it's gonna look like a monster. And you're like, what the hell is this? Like, and this happens to me too, like, you know, speaking is always maybe a little easier in one sense, but writing especially, but even speaking, like you have a idea that you cannot express. And sometimes I know you know it. I know you understood it. Well, don't know, but I suspect that you do, but you cannot express it. You cannot say it. And therefore, you know, we sort of education is really kind of this notion of, I mean, some people say regurgitation. I don't think it is. There is no pure regurgitation, because once you start expressing it yourself, it becomes something else. I mean, in philosophy, in this kind of language, I'm sure like if we were doing 2 + 2 = 4, everybody will write 2 + 2 = 4. I mean, this is not like information. This is not knowledge in a sort of one-to-one correspondence sort of way. This is the process of thinking, and that's the creative imagination. And, you know, sometimes I say certain things, you kind of agree, but you don't know why you agree. And you sort of think of other things that to connect to that, but then it becomes a mess. And then usually you react to that because you are not in control. And you are like, one of the things that students say to me the most ever since I came to, or ever since I started teaching, is like confusing. It's like confusing. Like, yes, it is confusing. That doesn't mean bad. Like, confusing always has this negative connotation. It's like, it is confusing, hence you are a bad teacher and this is a horrible class because I'm confused. That's like, what is your expectation? Not to be confused? I mean, that's just like unrealistic. I think people should be more confused. I think the problem comes as, maybe this is what Kate meant too. At least I understood what she said. Like, people should be morally confused a little bit more rather than being like not confused, clear, simple-minded, simplistic. I mean, we all talk about like modern life is so complicated and refuse to be confused and say very dogmatic things about it at the same time. Like, everybody is an expert on COVID, everybody is an expert on politics, everybody is an expert on fascism, everybody, unfortunately, thinks that they are an expert on racism and not only know how to be racist and non-racist, but they can also teach it to other people. It's a mess. Be confused. That's my job.
I think, sorry, go on.
No, that's it.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, I think there, you can read philosophy. I think anyone can read philosophy, but I think if you wanna philosophize, you have to read, you have to write. Sorry, that's what I came to.
Yeah.
The conclusion. I don't know how that is, or how that comes to be. Maybe because of this that we're talking, but I feel like, yeah, it doesn't really. Yeah.
How many
Just
of you
like,
write, actually?
huh?
Do you write?
I mean, like in general.
Yeah.
Yeah, but not about philosophy. Well, no.
You cannot say that. Yeah.
We do write about philosophy in our classes, but yeah.